If you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering what the title is all about. And I want to talk about something that I see quite frequently, honestly, in these YouTube videos or in the comments, and it is this idea of I hate the Chinese government, but I love the Chinese people. And I find this really interesting, and I kind of want to talk about it because the concept of it is fascinating to me, because it's a lot of mental gymnastics to basically say, I don't agree with the government, but I don't want people to attack me, or I don't want to seem like I'm a racist, or I don't want to seem like I am some kind of person that is attacking the Chinese people. So I will use this shield of I hate the government, but I love the people. And I find it interesting because I see this in a lot of videos, to be honest. They'll say, oh, the Chinese government is so bad, they do X, Y, Z, but it's not the Chinese people's fault. I love the Chinese people. I just want the Chinese people to prosper, and I just want what's best for the Chinese people. And it comes from a lot of vloggers, a lot of people that criticize China. It also comes from news media companies that are trying to distinguish between Chinese people and the Chinese government and say, let's hate the Chinese government and make the Chinese government look bad, but somehow there's a wall between what the Chinese government does and the people. And one of the things that I find most interesting about it is many of these people have never been to China, and the ones that have been to China and maybe have lived here for many years still want to push this line that they love the Chinese people but hate the government, and they don't accept that those are one and the same. You know, they act like when the Communist Party of China took over in 1949, that they did it with this oppressive revolution, and then they just took control of the country without the support of the people, which is not entirely true, right? Revolutions only happen when the people support that revolution. And so there's footage of Mao Zedong entering Beijing with the Red Army, and people were on the streets cheering with their flags and saying, hey, this is a new opportunity for us, because they were getting rid of the old government that they saw as corrupt and inefficient. It was a revolution. And so a lot of these comments will say, well, the Chinese government wasn't elected by the people, and so therefore they're not legitimate. As if that's the only form of government that is available, or the only form of government that is legitimate. And I find it really interesting because basically these vloggers or these people are racist. And they want to say racist things, and they want to say harmful and damaging things about China, but they don't want to deal with the consequences of being honest to their audience and to themselves. They do hate China, because if you love someone, and you truly love someone, you're not going to go around smearing their name and creating hate towards them. It's mental gymnastics where you're saying, I can love one thing or one aspect of the society, but I'm going to attack the other aspect of it, the government or other aspects of it, and make them look really bad. And then when people click on my videos and watch them or read my articles, or when I do interviews and I talk about how bad China is, people that are watching it won't be able to distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese government, so China becomes a big umbrella for everything that the government does and everything the people do. And so when these videos go out to millions of people, presumably mostly Americans, they get this idea that China is bad, and they don't distinguish between the two. And so when they see Chinese people on the streets, they think, oh, Chinese people are bad, because that is the logical path, that if you say China's bad, China's bad, China's bad, then I think, oh, Chinese are bad. The other thing that I don't really accept, or that I find really interesting, is that many of these people who say the Chinese government is bad don't actually accept that the Chinese people have accepted this government, right? These are the people that are coming from countries that are maybe a few hundred years old, saying our way is the best way and you should adopt our way, and telling that to the Chinese people who have a population 3 or 4 times their own country, in some cases 10 times or 100 times their own country, and saying my way is the best way, and I support the Chinese people when they protest labor disputes or when they protest lockdowns. And I think, and I make videos saying, this is the end, the Chinese government, the people are finally rising up. Yay, let's support the people. And then when the people stop those protests and go back to a normal level, they say, oh, the Chinese government is so oppressive. And they never acknowledge that the Chinese people have accepted their government and that they are the ones who get to decide if it's too tyrannical or too oppressive. Not some white guy like myself or some white guy in the United States putting out content. It's up to the Chinese people. And when the Communist Party took over in China, the people supported and accepted that. That is why the nationalist government failed. And that is why that government failed. Even with the support of the United States, that government failed, and they ended up in Taiwan. So anybody that says that the Chinese government is somehow not part of the Chinese society clearly has never lived here in China and clearly doesn't engage with Chinese people that often. Because when I worked for state-run enterprises, state-owned enterprises, I talked to people on a daily basis. I worked for an oil company and I worked for a media company here. And those were state-owned enterprises. And this 96 million people that are part of, 93 million, 96 million people, something around there, that are part of the Communist Party of China, are basically there because it's expected. Not because they're supporting the party. I'd say 20% of them are actually hardcore supporters of the government and saying China is this, China's the future. And probably the other 80% are just party members because they see it as an opportunity to advance their career. Many state-run companies and many companies in general have a Communist Party division, so to say, within the company. And that Communist Party division has power within the company, especially in the state-owned companies. And they're the ones who set a lot of rules about what is acceptable within the organization. I remember many times not many times, once a week, the party members would go have a party meeting. And I would always be like, what are you guys talking about in there? And they would come back and be like, oh, it's the stupidest thing ever. We have to pay our monthly fees, and we have to talk about Xi Jinping thought, which was the thing that's still going on, and that was the thing when I was working for the state-run companies. They would talk about this Xi Jinping thought, and they would talk about what they have done throughout the week or throughout the month to implement the Xi Jinping thought. Say that 100 times fast. But they would basically have these meetings, and I'd ask them, what'd you guys talk about? And it was always like, it was stupid. And I remember people who were not party members were joining the party, and I said, why are you joining? It doesn't seem like what's the point? And they're saying, oh, I'm joining because it's for my career. I'm in this state-run company, and if I ever want to be in upper management, I have to be a party member. So people will look at this party and say there's almost 100 million people that are part of the party, and they're this oppressive force. If you look at the actual percentage of how many people are in the party, which is, I think, 93, I'll look up the number, put it on the screen. I think it's 93 million people, versus the total population of China, that is like 4% of the population, something like that. And China's military, standing military, is 1.2 or 1.3 million active duty members, which means that's even, that's also a small percentage of the total population. Anybody that's saying that the Chinese people are under this great oppression and they could never overthrow their government, and that, they're always, anytime they try and protest or anytime they try and do anything, they're always shut down and, oh, it's so terrible here, it's all terrible. It's like, no. if even 100 million people, which is basically like 2 cities, like 2 or 3 cities, it's literally the Jinjinji area, which they're trying to turn into a mass city here. If all those people were like, we don't want the government anymore, they would literally be able to overthrow the Chinese government. And I'm not suggesting they should, because it's not my decision to make. But if they wanted to, they literally could pretty easily, because there aren't even enough party members that are full, like, supporters of the party to stop it. And there's not enough military, 1.3 million active duty soldiers, and that's like 1%. Like, it's a percentage point of the overall population. So anybody that's saying that, I love the Chinese people, but I hate the government, are basically saying, I hate China. And they just don't want to admit it because they're afraid maybe there'll be backlash for saying that. And I always say, the Chinese people, there's many, many of them compared to the actual government officials, and the actual government officials that would maybe rally behind the party, because a large portion of them are members by name and by association only. They don't really care what the party does. And as a matter of fact, many of them are just kind of like, whatever, I'm a party member because it benefits my career. So I have to say, okay, if the Chinese people could overthrow their government if they wanted to, and they don't, then maybe your argument about the Chinese people being oppressed and that the Chinese people don't have any freedoms or freedom of expression or freedoms, period, is maybe not fully thought out. Because the way I look at it, from living in China and talking to Chinese people and looking out at the world, who are they supposed to emulate? Like, what government are they supposed to look to for great leadership in developing their society? Many of these people are living in the United States, and we can look at the United States, at the democracies of the United States, and their societies and their governments aren't run that much more efficiently than here in China. We can say, okay, well, you have gun violence, you have terrible health insurance, you have terrible labor laws, you have terrible public transportation, and you have politics that are completely corrupted by the corporations and that aren't actually doing things to help the people. Should we copy that government? Every 2 years, there's an election, and people are so caught up in this election cycle of first the Senate and the Congress, and then the presidential, and then over and over and over again, that society is getting more and more divided based on all this constant media of elections and who's right. We have the debt ceiling going on right now. That whole debate that just went through. Of course, they were going to raise the debt ceiling, but who should China be looking at for great leadership? South Africa? I don't know. Didn't they end apartheid just 50 years ago or something? I mean, who are they to morally say that China is oppressing their minorities? Or India, right? We can say that India and China basically gained independence at the same time from their previous government. So the Communist Party took over in 1949, and in India they broke away from British rule around that same time. I'd have to look up the exact date. They developed into a democracy. China went the socialist route. And when we look at the statistics side by side, when we look at key performance indicators, China's winning in almost all of those indicators. And then we could say, well, similar population size. So should they have the same government as India and be in the same situation as India? And nothing against India, I've never been there, but when we look at the data, we can see that China's economy is quite a bit larger than India's. We can see that life expectancy in China is higher. We can see that quite a few things that we would look at, and I'll put a list up here. China is performing better. So who should the Chinese government be emulating? Who should they be looking at for great leadership? and has for citizens when they look out to the world and they look at all the other societies. Should they look at France? France was burning. The capital was burning like 2 months ago. Should they look at Canada? Well, they have riots and the truckers and more riots and more controlling policies going into effect, essentially to control the people, which is looking more and more like what China's already doing. Should they look to Australia? Well, Australia's not been that great to their indigenous people or their minorities. So, like, who are they really supposed to look at and say, let's overthrow our current government and replace it with this government, which is doing so much better than the Chinese government currently? Because when I look around China, I say it's a fairly stable society. It's a fairly stable politically. The economy is growing. Yes, it's slowed down because of the past few years, but it has been growing at a pretty steady rate. Most people can improve their lives, right? If we look back at the last 3 or 4 generations, life has been improving for most people. Now we're running into some issues with the younger generation in terms of our jobs. But overall, if we look at grandparents and then parents and then this generation, they have the opportunity to improve. We do the same thing in the United States. My grandparents and my parents are better off than me. So it's gone down in the United States, whereas it's gone up in China in terms of most of the things that people care about. So when these people come on these videos saying, oh, I love the Chinese people are great, but the government is terrible, I have to say, well, what government are you looking at? If you look at very hyper-specific issues, then yeah, you'll find problems. You can find that in every country, there's problems. But if you look at the macro, if you look at the bigger picture and you say, where was China before the Communist Party took over and where are they now? And if you still say that they would be better off with a democracy, then you're just lying to yourself, to be honest. And you're lying to your audience, because you can clearly see how China has progressed over the last 74, 75 years of the Communist Party. And you might say, oh, well, there was famine and there was this and there was that. And I was like, yeah, but every government has to deal with their problems. And what we look for is how efficient and how effective is that government at providing services and providing a better life for its citizens. And when we look at countries like the United States or Australia or Canada or some of these other ones, even France, a lot of that says it's been kind of a toss-up. Some things have gotten better, some things have gotten worse, but overall, it's been kind of this kind of gradual decline, and the statistics back that up. As for in China, it's been a pretty sharp increase and now a flattening out, I would say. And so this is where China's going to start having issues, is with this flattening out. What can they do to maintain support, and what can they do to continue to increase people's livelihood and their conditions? But anybody that's coming along and saying that China is like the Chinese government is awful and terrible, I'm very suspect on what they are watching and what they are looking at. Because yeah, of course there's issues in every government, and I'm not saying that they're saints. But what I'm saying is overall, the macro picture, the data tracks upward for China. And when you talk to people, especially if you say, well, what were your parents or what were your grandparents' lives like when they were growing up? They say, oh, it was awful for them. And I say, well, what about your life now? And they say, well, it's okay. I have a job. I have an apartment. Things are expensive, but it's okay. So be wary of anyone that says, I love the Chinese people but hate the Chinese government, because they're probably being dishonest, and they're probably trying to paint China in a very specific light without having to deal with the consequences of being called idiots. So I don't know. What is your thought? Do you think that China would be a better country if the CCP or the CPC was to be dissolved in some form of other government? Because again, this is what they're saying. Chinese government is awful for the Chinese people, and so therefore it essentially should be replaced. This is their argument. So do you think that that is a fair argument, or do you think that these people are just spouting this nonsense for clicks and that they actually do hate China and it's not about the Chinese government, it's just about their opinion of China? They don't care about the people or the government. I don't know. Leave your comments below, because especially if you're Chinese, let me know, because I do have some people who are from mainland China who watch my videos. Let me know specifically what you think. Do you think that your government is mistreating its people and that you would be better off with a different form of government? Or do you think that no, the current government has done pretty well by its people, and sure, there's been some hiccups along the way and there's been some ups and downs, but overall the macro picture is improvement? So leave a comment, because that's really fascinating to me, because again, I'm just some random white guy who lives here, and I'm no better than the random white guys that live in other countries saying these crazy things about the Chinese government. So I think it's most important is to talk to the actual people that live here and actually have an opinion about their own government and their own lives, especially looking back to their parents and grandparents. So leave a comment, and hopefully you like this video. Also, subscribe. We just passed 60K, which is totally awesome. We're headed towards 100K soon. Hopefully in the next few months we can get there. And obviously, if you share the videos or like or comment or do all that stuff, it helps people see this perspective and possibly they like it. And also, subscribe. If you want to see something else, you can click here, where I walked out on the streets and talked a little bit about some of my opinions about China.